to talk about making JavaScript easier to learn, because I think all of us here have learned JavaScript at some point, so it's something that we should all be able to, actually know something about. So we'll start with a survey, and I can almost kind of see all of you. So how many of you, and be honest here, I think you should all be honest, because there's nothing wrong with learning something for the first time. We should all be proud of learning something new. So how many of you didn't know JavaScript until this morning? Anyone? Okay. All right, cool. How many of you learned JavaScript in the last month? Okay, last 6 months? 1 year? Okay, 2 years? 5 years? 10 years? 20 years? You're lying. It was 18 years ago it was invented. Okay, so that's just to check who the liars are. So we have people who've learned JavaScript, over a long spectrum of time here. And when we start learning JavaScript, a lot of us, it was, a lot of people said like 5 years ago, right? So we don't even remember what it was like when we were first getting to know JavaScript. So we start with these basic things like variables, arrays, and objects and loops, and then we move on to learning about the DOM and libraries and closures, and then we get crazy and start using prototypes and mixins, and then we go to dotJS and we learn about all these new things that are coming in next versions of JavaScript. And then one day, hopefully, we become Brendan Eich. That's our goal. So my next question is, do you think that more people should learn JavaScript? Woo! All right. Very good. And I think this is actually a fair question to ask, especially since we just had a talk about not JavaScript. And the interesting thing about JavaScript, because I think about this a lot too, because I teach a lot. And JavaScript started off as this language of browsers, and then because of that, then Chrome wanted to make their browser really fast, so then they made V8, and because they made V8 so fast, people were like, oh, that's cool, we're going to make Node.js, and it's going to be a server. And then once Node.js was a thing, people started making robots out of that, and then other people, they wanted to make mobile apps, and they're like, well, I already know JavaScript, and I wanted to work multiple platforms, so they made PhoneGap. And then there's all these other random uses, like using it to make games and Photoshop. So it started off as this language just for the web, but now it's everywhere. So it is a really useful language to learn because not only is it going to benefit you for the web, but you're going to start using it on server and mobile and games and hardware and all these places. So I really think that it helps me feel good at night when I think about teaching JavaScript, to think about all these different ways that you can use it. But the thing is, and this is something that we maybe don't remember, because for many of us it was 5 years ago, which was ages. But learning JavaScript is hard. I mean, learning anything is hard, but learning JavaScript is particularly hard, especially if it's your first programming language. It's kind of weird at times. And it's easy to forget how hard it is, but luckily, these days, I always remember how hard it is, because I'm surrounded by people that are learning JavaScript, both in my work and my free time. So as you're saying, I work for Khan Academy now, and what I do for Khan Academy is I teach the programming curriculum. So I figure out how we're going to teach the next generation of kids and teenagers programming, because we actually want to get more people learning programming at an early age, and hopefully one day it becomes something that everybody learns in middle school or high school. I think that is just as useful as a lot of the math that we had to learn then. So we teach JavaScript because the people, when they started the programming curriculum on Khan Academy a couple years ago, it was started by John Resig, which we all know, jQuery inventor. And he was like, well, I want to teach something online, and the obvious language to teach is JavaScript. So he came up with this environment where we use the open source ACE editor so that they can actually code in the browser, and then use the processing.js library. And processing.js is the JavaScript port of the processing library, which was originally designed by MIT in order to teach programming to non-programmers. So it's actually a pretty cool way to get started. And it's awesome because you get to make all these cool drawings and animations and stories and games. And it's something that everybody seems to actually really enjoy doing. So I pretty much spend my day like drawing animals and stuff, which is kind of an amazing life. So we have that environment for them to program in, and we have a full curriculum that teaches from the basics, like variables, all the way through to now object-oriented programming, which I just put out last week. And they learn via these talk-throughs, which are kind of like videos, but they're actually interactive coding things, so you could actually pause and edit the code at any time, which is kind of cool. And it's all using HTML5 audio and web workers and cool shit. And then we also need to, what's really important to us is actually assess what they've learned, because you can watch videos all day and still not understand anything you just looked at. It's really easy to do that. It's very passive. So we have these coding challenges where they actually have to go and write code to match the instructions, and we send the code through Esprima, and we analyze the abstract syntax tree to see have they got the kind of structures we're looking for, and they have some flexibility, but they also have to meet some structure. So that's basically how we teach JavaScript online for Khan Academy. I also teach JavaScript in real life with like actual flesh people, like you guys. So I teach it for an organization called Girl Develop It, San Francisco, and it's all it's all women that we're teaching, and it's a really cool community. And so we teach starting from HTML, CSS, and then going through JavaScript 101, and then all the way through to actually all the way through to like Backbone and object-oriented JS. And all of our materials is online if any of you guys want to take them and teach them. So that means that with these two experiences, I'm basically just always surrounded by people that are learning JavaScript for the first time. So it's interesting on Khan Academy because I'm seeing it at scale. It's like what happens when you try to teach thousands of people JavaScript and they're coming from all over the world and all different ages. And so we've had like 200,000 challenges completed and 300,000 unique programs created. So there's a lot of people learning JavaScript there. So it's kind of learning at scale. And then Girl Develop It, it's way smaller classes. It's like 30 people in each class. So I don't get to learn at scale that much, but I do get to be there in person when they're struggling with JavaScript and when it looks like they're about to cry and when it looks like they're about to leave. And I can see what it is that actually makes them struggle. So I really like to combine those two experiences together to try and figure out how to teach JavaScript better. So when I was thinking about what talk to give today, I was like, well, the thing that I think about all the time now is how we can make JavaScript easier to learn for all these people, because you guys all agreed that we want more people to learn JavaScript. So if we could just make JavaScript easier to learn, then we'll get more people past that beginner hump. And this is something I think about a lot, but there's a lot of ways that you guys could help me, and then it'll further our goal altogether. And then, next year for dotJS, they'll have to get a theater that fits like 3,000 people. It'd be sweet. So I want to talk about a few different ways that you guys could help make JavaScript easier to learn. So the first part is the actual language itself, right? We're actually using JavaScript as a language. And there's actually a lot of researchers that spend their time researching the usability of languages and the learnability of languages. So I do actually spend my Saturday nights reading research papers because my parents both got PhDs and I never got a PhD, but I figure if I read enough research papers, maybe it'll make it up to them. But there's this cool group, it's at CMU, Carnegie Mellon, and they dedicate their whole time to researching programming language usability, and they've got some really great papers there that I've linked to. And they go through and there's this one very interesting paper where they looked at something like 70 different research papers that looked at programming language usability, and they categorized all the different problems according to the Nielsen usability categories. So they really try to approach it as a user experience problem, because it is a user experience when you're trying to learn something, the experience of that learning. So I went this morning and just looked at examples that show the things that they showed in their papers. So one of the categories is when you're trying to learn something and it's inconsistent with your external knowledge about the world. So a lot of people come into programming knowing about variables in math. Variables in math work so differently than variables in JavaScript or in any programming language. So that's where we get a ton of questions. And if you actually look at our challenge completion rates for the things before variables are 80%, and then in variables they go down to like 55%, 50%. So people are really actually having a hard time trying to understand variables. And part of that is like, maybe I need to do a better job teaching it. The other part of it is just that variables are hard, especially because of how many differences there are between programming variables and math variables. And a lot of these kids are actually learning both at the same time, which is kind of a crazy thing to do. Another problem is just inconsistent syntax. So we get a lot of questions about semicolons. How do you know where to put a semicolon? Well, we would say, oh, well, semicolons always go at the end of statements and not blocks. But then you have to say, and then they ask the question, how do you know the difference between a statement and a block? And it's like, well, you just know. That's hard. It doesn't necessarily make sense. Another question, like, why can't we multiply and divide strings? And that's a valid question, right? Like Nicholas earlier was talking about operator overloading. We can do the plus operator on strings, but that's the only operator we can do on strings. And so if you're learning strings for the first time, it's like, well, how come I plus them that way, but I can't multiply them that way? And there are some languages that actually let you do that. So, you know, anytime there's inconsistent syntax, you learn one thing and you're trying to apply that pattern to other things. When you can't apply it, it becomes harder. There's also a lot of non-intuitive syntax. So I found that most of these problems in the Boolean operators, lots of questions like what does 2 ampersands mean? Why is it 2 ampersands and not 1 ampersand? Why isn't it just and? And the best response to that is because those are the rules. Somebody just decided at some point that it was going to be 2 ampersands, and that's just how it goes. And actually, the hardest part of those operators is that a lot of people can't even type the OR operator on their keyboard. The people who designed most programming languages used English language keyboards, which have a different configuration than like Spanish and Germanic. So the top question we have there is, how do I even write an OR if I don't have it on my keyboard? Which is like a really good question. There's also some unnecessary, some redundant syntax. So the question we get a lot is, what's the difference between plus plus and plus equals 1? I mean, you can go into a long thing about post-decrement and all that stuff, but really, we don't need plus equals 1 when we have plus plus. And so people will get confused because they're like, why do you have 2 things that do the same thing? Because they don't understand why you would have these 2 different constructs. And then people also get confused about for loop and while loop. Why do we have these 2 different loops? It's like, well, one's kind of a special case, something that we like to do a lot, yada, yada. But, you can kind of do the same thing with both. So you could argue that, you could simplify and you won't need all that stuff. Now, if you look at all of those issues are not unique to JavaScript. All of those were actually inherited from languages that JavaScript was inspired from, right? Maybe Java, C++, et cetera. So as it turns out, and most of the research that's been done has been done in the earlier languages, in C++ and Java and Pascal and Fortran, et cetera. There hasn't been, I've tried, I haven't found much research specifically on JavaScript usability itself. So I can't see anything, scientifically about whether JavaScript is more usable than Java. But I can say that it has a lot of the issues that those other languages have. So possibly we could actually change ECMAScript, and you could actually contribute to the ES discuss list, and you could say, well, we've seen that it might be better if we change all these things about the language. But as it turns out, pretty much with languages, most of them kind of suck. Like, most of them just, because most of them we started off with this original language that had all these non-intuitive things in it, and we just kept making new languages based on it. And so now we're left with all these languages that kind of suck in the same way. So, on the one hand, that's not great, but on the other hand, like, all right, maybe we'll just deal with it. And when I talked with these researchers, they said that they now focus less on the language itself, and they focus more on the debugging tools. Because it's hard to change a language. It's hard to come up with a perfect language. Every language is probably going to be a little bit hard to learn. It's going to be hard to have variables that work the same as they do in math. So that they now focus on improving the debugging tools, because that's something that you can reasonably improve. And you could do that for any language, and you could do that across languages. So yeah, we can talk about issues with the JavaScript language design, but I think it's a lot more interesting and actionable to actually look at the debugging tools. So when we think about debugging tools, we think about the environments. So we'll do another survey of environments. So how many of you here use Sublime Text? Oh, nice. TextMate? That's kind of old school. We got one. Yeah. Vim and Emacs. All right, so now you guys know who to punch afterwards. So we have all these IDEs, but none of these IDEs, and there's other ones too, but these seem to be pretty popular. None of these IDEs are actually specifically made for JavaScript. These are kind of lightweight developers that we can use. We can use them for our Python and our JavaScript and all that stuff. But the important thing is all of these IDEs were designed to be extendable, designed to work with plugins. And so most people, hopefully, are using plugins to make their development experience better, plugins that are customized for that language. So for all of these IDEs, there are JSHint plugins. So how many of you are using a JSHint plugin? Okay, cool. So I wore my JSHint shirt just to show you that you should be using JSHint. So JSHint, we've already heard about today. It's the tool that's going to check your JavaScript for errors and best practices and warnings. And it's a thing that I try and get every new developer to use and put in their IDE. And for Sublime Text, I always tell them to get Sublime Linter. And it's just really, really important to have that in there because you want to find out about those errors in the IDE before you have to go and load it in the browser. And I'll say with JSHint, the guy who made it, Anton, he's actually my ex-boyfriend. And I still recommend it, okay? And it's rough for me, because every time I see a JSHint message, I'm like, you can't control me any, but then I do what the message says, because it's right. No, he's a cool kid. And we also see JSHint show up in online tools. So Replit has JSHint in it. Replit is what I use in the Girl Develop It workshops when we're just learning JavaScript basics. JSBin from Remy seems to also have it built in, and that's what we use in our Intro to Web Dev workshops, because it's just easy to get started with doing stuff online and not have naturally install IDEs. So it's kind of everywhere. And then we also use it on Khan Academy. So as people are typing, we're actually sending, we use a little web worker, we send their code to JSHint, we process it, we see if there's any problems, and then we pop up our friend Oh Knows Guy, who some people really, really hate and some people love, and they kind of have debates about it. But Oh Knows Guy will tell you what's wrong with your code. And so we get the JSHint errors and warnings and all that stuff. So the thing is, when we started with this, we started with the default JSHint messages, but then we realized that they didn't really seem very friendly. They didn't seem very conversational. So we went through and we conversationalized everything. So you see like this one, expected an identifier, instead saw comma. So this is somebody who has an extra comma without an argument. So we changed that to, I thought you were going to type an identifier, but you typed comma. So that's kind of nicer, more conversational. But then I started monitoring user feedback and seeing what errors people still weren't understanding and weren't able to overcome. And one of those was this one, and I looked at it and I was like, that still doesn't make much sense. Because first of all, who knows what an identifier is? We never talk about identifiers when we're teaching JavaScript. We talk about variables. We talk about property names. And it also doesn't really tell you how to fix it either. So I went into the JSHint code and I kind of changed the parser a little bit and made it more specific so that now I can say, I think you meant to type a value or a variable name before that comma. So I think that's a much better message, and I've had less errors. Students run into less errors with this now because of the better message. So that's what I've started doing, is actually monitoring the kind of things that people are running into that they don't understand and the errors that show up, and trying to improve those error messages. So you can see a few more here, and a lot of time trying to give them more explanation and more actionable things that they can do. But some of them are hard to change. It's, when somebody says 140 equals 141 plus 142, I don't know what they're trying to do there. Like, it's hard for me to give them some specific action. And other things are just really confusing to parse. But we can make a lot of improvements, and I have a link to a whole spreadsheet of tons more errors there that you can look at that people have made on Khan Academy when learning to code. And you might look at those and think like, oh, they're obvious, but when somebody is this is like their first 2 hours of learning to code, none of this is obvious. This is all just really weird, because we've just made up what syntax is. It could be, in another world, it could look something completely different. In another language, it could look different. So having these messages is really useful. So, and I've actually put some of my changes back in JSHint, and that's something that all of you could do too. So you can actually check out JSHint, and there's actually a messages.js. So you could even go through the messages.js and look at those messages. Or if you see a JSHint message that you look at it and you're like, oh, that's weird, you could just go and even fork it in the browser and submit a pull request. And Anton is very nice. He's a very good boyfriend, and he'll accept your pull requests. And another thing that you could do that could be interesting is you could actually translate the messages. So this is something that we do for the Khan Academy messages, is we actually translate them into the main languages that we support. Because that's nice if you can actually get messages in the language you understand. Like you could argue that, hey, if you're learning programming, you should just learn English too. But should you have to learn programming and English at the same time? Like, what if you wanted to learn programming when you're 12 years old and you're, a student not in America? You should be able to get these messages in your language, in your language of choice, and then, eventually maybe you'll learn English and that'll help you become a better programmer. But I think it'd be really cool if JSHint actually formally had support for message translations, and that could help people that are using it that don't quite have a grasp of English. Because these messages are really confusing, and I personally feel that the time when you have to be the most helpful for people learning to program is when they have an error. Because that's the time when they want to bang their head against the wall, when they want to go and binge, and they want to just give up. And I've had people walk out of workshops when they've had an error, because it's hard. And if they're like 45-year-old, they never programmed before, it's really intimidating. So that's the debugging, that's a really important time, because that's when people are at their lowest. So you want to help them out when they're at the lowest. And if you can help them out by having a more friendly message that makes more sense and is in their language, then that is really, really helpful. So this is something that all of you could do. We also have additional hinters. So there's the baby hint. So baby hint checks for spelling. Spelling is a big thing. English is really hard to spell. You guys probably know that. It's just a really weird language. People make spelling mistakes all the time. They also make capitalization mistakes all the time, because they don't realize that programming languages are case sensitive at first, so they'll very often capitalize things the wrong way and not realize why it's not working. So we send all of us stuff through a spell checker whenever we see an undefined variable from JSHint and say, okay, maybe there's a little typo that we can send it through. We also check number of arguments. So I know that sounds weird, because in JavaScript you can have however many arguments you want to a function. However, sometimes if you pass in the wrong number of arguments to a function and it's not really working the way you expect it to, you can kind of sit there scratching your head for a while, and it can take you a while to realize that, oh, you passed in 5 instead of 4 arguments, and it didn't know what to do with that 5th. So we actually check the number of arguments for all the processing JS functions, and we let people know, like, oh, hey, looks like you might actually have added an extra one there. So it just helps them out. So I put both of those in that gist if you want to check out the code for how we do both of those. Because we haven't actually pushed that anywhere external. So I think it'd be cool to actually get this in some linting, maybe for specific libraries like jQuery or Backbone or whatever. And so I don't think it really belongs in JSHint, but I think it could belong in ESLint. So ESLint is a new linter based on Esprima. So it parses the JavaScript, and you can make up all these rules for it based on parsing the JavaScript. And it's designed to be something that's easy to extend in however you want to extend it. So if you're thinking about interesting ways to help people out with their JavaScript, I would check out both JSHint and ESLint and see maybe where it would fit in there. And I think something like spelling and capitalization, that's something might actually belong more in ESLint. But once again, ESLint, active project, they would love to have contributors like all of you. There's one IDE I didn't talk about yet, and that's the browser. All right, so we do a lot of our development in IDEs, but then eventually we go out to the browser if we're doing web development. But then other people just are entirely developing in the browser. If you're on an iPad and you're learning web development, you might just open up Chrome DevTools and actually just use some JavaScript there. And that's actually how we do our first assignments for the Girl Developer workshops. And you know what? We have a lot of really, really amazing tools in Chrome and Firefox, but they're still not perfect. There's still ways they can be better. So some examples, these are errors that people are running into at the last workshop. So when you write in Chrome, if you write var x equals 10, it will then say undefined. Now, the reason it says that is because this statement var x equals 10, that sort of statement returns undefined. And so then Chrome shows it. But to a newbie, they're kind of freaking out, like, why does it say undefined? You kind of expect it to say 10. It kind of seems intuitive that if it's going to say anything, it would say 10. So I always have to say, don't worry that it says undefined. It's cool. It's fine. Another thing is that if you go and write document.element by ID, it'll say, oh, it has no method named this. And I've seen people just stare at their browser for like 10 minutes trying to understand what went wrong, because it looks like they did it right. And the difference is just that they capitalized the D. And of course, it's a lowercase d, and we all know that. But it's really hard to know that, right? It'd be really simple for Chrome to just say, oh, maybe you meant to type it this way instead. So they could bring in that spell check in there, and that would help people out a lot. So there's some examples of things that can throw people off in Chrome. And the thing is that these things are improving. So Anton now works at Mozilla on the Firefox tools, and he put together a demo a few months ago of actually having Firefox check for misspelled variable names automatically and saying, oh, did you mean this variable from line blah? And then it'll even automatically fix it for you. So this is something that browsers could do, you know, if we push them to do it. Or we could just patch the browsers ourselves, right? So most of the browsers that we're learning in are open source, right? So we have Chrome and Chromium and Firefox, and there's a bunch of great resources. Firefox has all these videos now. So you could actually patch the DevTools. You could also make a DevTool plugin. They both have ways of extending DevTools if you aren't actually sure if it belongs in like core DevTools. And for those browsers that aren't open source, you could just write a blog post, like a really ranty blog post, and then we could all retweet it and get people to try and get their browser attention. Because the people that work for IE, like I know some of them, they're actually developers that really actually care about other developers. Like somebody I worked with at Google, he specifically left Google to go join IE because he said the hardest part of being a developer at Google was IE, and he wanted to make it better for everybody else. So now he works on IE DevTools. So there's good people there. So final aspect that you can think about is documentation for JavaScript. Some people do actually read the documentation, not many. But when we say what are the docs, if you do a search, you're going to find W3 Schools, you're going to find MDN. Now, W3 Schools, it's this for-profit, and you know, it's a corporation, and so we kind of always like to hate on it, but it is really newbie-friendly, and so I know this is bad, but I still recommend it to most newbies because it is really good for them to learn from, especially for these basic things. And you can actually report errors on it. So on the bottom of the page, you see an error, you can go and fix it, just report error. And then MDN is also a great resource, and there it's a wiki, so you can click edit. So we were talking earlier about documentation. Anytime you see documentation that's wrong, there's usually a way to fix it. Just spend like a couple more minutes because you're going to make it so much easier for the next person that comes along. So you see, those are some of the ways that you guys could help make JavaScript easier to learn. And I think the big thing is the debugging and improving the existing debugging tools, but we might also come up with new debugging tools, like ways to understand our program flow and visualize the way variables are changing over time. There's tons more stuff we can think about, but I think it's good because I think if we work on those debugging tools, like if we improve JSHint, it's going to be better both for the new people learning to code and for all of us too, because we're still using all this stuff today, and we'll get more people learning JavaScript. And it's good because this is a shot from one of the workshops. This is what I live for, is when somebody is like learning JavaScript and then they have that moment. And this will always happen during one of the workshops, so I kind of just sit there with my camera just ready for it, like eyeing the room, like seeing who's going to do it. And then they'll be like, yes, and I'm like, because that is such an awesome moment when that happens, and you're like, they got it, right? So we want more people to have this, yes, I got it, with JavaScript, right? So maybe you can help with that. Merci.